Greetings, this is the Sneaky Cheese Man, and today I'm bringing you a Dune Spice Wars video. For this video, we're going to be focusing on one of the new counselors available to House Harkonnen. Now, there's been a lot of debate about how to use the new counselors with each of the factions, considering all the changes and mechanics with the release of patch 2.0. So, I decided to make this video to explain some of the ways you can use one of the new counselors, Cron Vatia. This video is going to assume that you already know the basic mechanics of Dune Spice Wars and how to play the game in general. Currently, Dune Spice Wars is on patch 2.0.4, so this information is current as of the making of this video, but not everything may stay the same as more balanced patches and hotfixes are added to the game. We're also not going to be covering some of the more advanced playstyles, but I will cover some brief tidbits about how to use Cron to give you an advantage in the military and how to be aggressive or defensive against other players, as well as some basic starting build orders and some general tips on how to use Cron effectively. For those of you who don't have much experience with House Harkonnen, let's just briefly talk about some of the things that makes House Harkonnen so different from the other factions, and also why they matter when we're talking about the new counselor Cron Vatia. First off, House Harkonnen has this unique ability called Oppression, where they can spend a small amount of manpower to oppress one of their villages. For a short time, this nearly doubles the output of the village, while also having a few other effects. I say nearly because the extra 100% output multiplier actually applies after most of the other production bonuses and penalties, which, when used correctly, can be extremely powerful. Now, this does come at a cost. First off, we're going to be spending a small amount of manpower that could be used for other purposes instead, such as crewing spice harvesters, adding militia, or recruiting units for our army. Secondly, after the oppression effect expires on a village, that village will suffer a temporary production penalty for a relatively long time. These penalties stack with each other, so over time, if you keep trying to squeeze more and more resources out of a village by oppressing it over and over again, you're going to find that that village will produce very few resources. And finally, oppressing a village can also cause rebels to spawn. Occasionally, at the beginning of each day, rebels will spawn in a village that's been recently oppressed, and will temporarily disable all buildings in your village, except for a few notable exceptions, and will shut down most of that village's production. Now, this doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing, but we'll talk more about that later. But generally speaking, rebels can be kind of a tough mechanic to deal with if you're new to the game and haven't had much experience with the oppression mechanic, but I'll show you some ways that we can actually use that to our advantage. Now, Harkonnen also has a couple of other weird bonuses and penalties to their village production. First off, Harkonnen villages naturally produce fewer resources than other factions. You'll see right here, one of their faction-specific bonuses, or rather penalties, is that they suffer a minus 10% resource production on each of their villages. Apparently, people don't like working for their Harkonnen very much. Now, this may sound like Harkonnen is actually pretty weak economically when compared to the other factions, but they also receive extra resource production for each militia that they have active in a village. So, your villages start off slightly weaker, but as you add more militia and start applying more and more production bonuses, Harkonnen villages end up actually being economic powerhouses, and on a reasonable terms, can outproduce all the other factions. Harkonnen also has a number of other faction bonuses, primarily related to espionage, particularly things like gaining intel when pillaging villages, or using agents to sacrifice them to get operations more quickly, but we're not going to focus too much on those, simply because they don't apply directly all that much to Cron Vatia. Now, what does Cron Vatia actually do? Cron Vatia is one of the newer counselors, and is very heavily focused around the oppression mechanic. Cron Vatia has this ability called Slave Trade, where whenever you oppress a village, that village gains construction speed of an additional 200%. Now, for clarification, this does not mean that your construction speed doubles. No, this actually means that you gain an additional 200% construction speed, meaning that you would now construct buildings at 3 times your normal rate. Most buildings in a village construct in 4 days. So, if you oppress a village with Cron as one of your counselors, that means that building would now construct in about 1.3 days. As you can imagine, constructing buildings quickly can be very useful, but we'll go more into depth on that later. Let's talk a little bit about the rest of what Cron can do. Now, whenever you oppress a village, you also get 2 manpower back for each empty and potential building slot. For clarification again, this does not mean that you start getting an income of manpower, so it does not actually directly affect the manpower production of that village. Instead, what this means is that as long as you have empty building slots, whether you've unlocked them or not, you get a small manpower refund for each of those slots every time you use oppression on that village. So, potentially, if you have 5 empty building slots, you can get 10 manpower back. Every building slot that ends up getting occupied by a building will reduce this refund and make your oppression give you less and less manpower back each time you activate it. Finally, Cron Vatia also gives you 50 Solari every time you kill a rebel. Now, rebels are kind of a weird unit. If you're not too familiar with the mechanic, rebels don't spawn by normal means. There are a few ways you can get rebels, but as Harkonnen, the primary way that you're going to get rebels is by the oppression mechanic. As I mentioned previously, for a certain amount of time after a village oppression expires, you'll have this penalty that reduces your production, but also causes a chance for rebels to spawn at the beginning of each day. The chance of this happening is semi-random, but usually the more and more you oppress a village, the more likely it is that rebels will spawn and it'll shut down your village's production. However, with Cron Vatia, rebels can actually be a good thing. Although rebels may shut down our production temporarily, when we kill those rebels, we start getting a small amount of Solari back for each one. And as you can imagine, the more and more villages you're oppressing, and the more and more rebels are spawning, the more and more money you can actually make back. Let's go ahead and talk a little bit about Cron synergy with other counselors. First off, we have Manpower. Manpower is a new counselor with 2.0 that replaces one of the previous counselors available to Harkonnen. Manpower provides a small amount of manpower each day, and it received a small nerf from 3 manpower down to 2 manpower with a recent patch. However, this 2 manpower per day is still pretty useful. Uman can provide a little bit of extra manpower that can help provide for stacking your militia in your villages early on, as well as fueling your oppressions, so you can keep building buildings quickly, and you can keep expanding your economy. Uman also has this ability where whenever you activate an operation in a region, your units gain +1 armor, which can be pretty useful when you're clearing out rebels and using operations such as scavenger teams. The armor isn't usually that big of a deal, as Harkonnen can usually kill rebels pretty quickly, but the extra manpower that Manpower provides can be extremely useful in getting your economy off the ground, and the armor can make it so your units are a little bit tankier. Next, we have Fade Rautha Harkonnen. Fade Rautha has this ability where whenever you have at least one village being oppressed, you gain 100% agent recruitment speed, as well as a small boost to your influence production. If you're using Cron, chances are you're going to be oppressing villages quite frequently throughout the early game, and pretty much non-stop once you have your economy and early developments figured out. You'll probably be getting this bonus pretty early, if not at the very beginning of the game, and semi-permanently from month 2 onwards. Getting extra agent speed is really good for any Harkonnen player, but it has some strong synergies with Cron specifically, as it allows us to start getting extra authority and manpower and other resources that can help us expand and keep our economy going. And finally, we have Piter de Vries. Again, another name that I'm probably mispronouncing. Piter doesn't have that many direct synergies with Cron, but there are a few strategies that I'll touch on that can utilize the oppression mechanic and Piter to be extremely potent. Piter can help you out economically with Cron by sacrificing agents for a swift injection of Solari, while also permanently discounting the cost of operations. Cron encourages you to quickly build lots and lots of buildings, which generally cost quite a bit of Solari in upkeep. Sacrificing an agent here or there can help you stay afloat economically until you start seeing returns from Cron. Also, Harkonnen has some developments in buildings that will end up giving you large amounts of intel from oppressing villages, which can combo nicely with Piter's discount. This can essentially allow you to practically non-stop spam the more expensive operations available to Harkonnen, such as sleeper agents, toxic vapors, and administrative burdens. This can be extremely oppressive against certain factions, as Pyre can make your operations cost very little intel. However, if you're oppressing enough villages and have some of the espionage-related developments, you're usually swimming in intel anyway, so I find that Pyre can be kind of overkill. So, all in all, as far as picking a second counselor to synergize with Cron, I generally pick either Uman or Feyd-Rautha, simply because they provide more immediate benefits to help fuel Cron's abilities. You can make Pyre work, but I would recommend either Uman if you're a new player and still learning how to manage the oppression mechanic, or pick Feyd-Rautha if you're confident in your ability to carefully manage rebellions and your manpower. Now that we've selected Cron, and we've talked a little bit about how we can use Cron with other counselors, let's move over to some actual gameplay and single player so I can walk you through some of the ways you can use Cron's abilities. So first off, I'm going to show you a few uses for Cron during the early stages of the game. Let's say we've just captured a new village. We have some decent Plascrete stored up at the very beginning of the game, and we want to get our economy going off the ground as soon as possible. How can we use Cron to address this? Well, as I mentioned previously, Cron lets us construct buildings really fast, but this bonus only applies as long as we're oppressing a village. Also, Cron gives pretty massive manpower refunds whenever we oppress villages with empty building slots. Right now, we have about 34 manpower available to us. Normally, oppression costs 20 manpower to use, but if we have Cron, then we can potentially get some of that manpower back whenever we use the oppression ability. So, let's go ahead and do that. Now, if you look at our manpower storage, we normally would spend 20 manpower to oppress this empty village, and we had 34 previously, so we should be at 14 manpower. But thanks to Cron, we got 10 of that manpower back, so effectively we're only spending 10 manpower, and in the early game when manpower is hard to come by, this is a huge bonus. Now let's take a look at this village. We just started oppressing it, but as you can see, it's still not producing anything. Well, under normal circumstances without Cron, I probably would not oppress a village that doesn't already have any buildings in it, as it's not producing anything, so the bonus resource production that we get from oppressing it wouldn't really be of any use. However, we do have Cron Vatia as our counselor, and this allows us to massively increase our construction speed. So let's go ahead and start deciding on making some buildings. Now, there are lots of ways that you can take advantage of Cron's construction bonus, such as being particularly aggressive by rushing out recruitment offices in order to start pillaging and attacking your neighbors, or by rushing knowledge and getting as many technologies and developments as you possibly can at the beginning of the game. The beauty of Cron Vatia is you can use them to efficiently trade your starting manpower stores to rush out whatever you need for your build as soon as possible. For now, we're going to focus on the more economic side of Cron, as the manpower route and the tech rush route are kind of more advanced playstyles that aren't very friendly to new players. So let's go ahead and just start building Plascrete factories. Now, Harkonnen in general is really hungry for Plascrete. With Cron Vatia, that's even more so true, as Cron's construction speed bonus allows you to get as much value as you can out of your Plascrete as soon as possible. Problem is, if we run out of Plascrete, then that construction speed bonus isn't really doing anything. And right now, at the beginning of the game, we don't have any bonuses to our economy from developments, we don't have militia to boost our village production, we don't have any discounts on our building costs, we don't have any main base buildings, we're just lacking in a lot of stuff that makes Harkonnen powerful. So I recommend building several Plascrete factories early and in most of your early villages. If you think about it, it makes sense, right? Cron speeds up our building speed, which means that we need to make more Plascrete in order to continue building buildings in order to expand our economy. At the beginning of the game, I recommend building a Plascrete factory in each of your first 3 or 4 villages, and more as needed throughout the game. Generally, we want to shoot for Plascrete income of about 150 to 200 or so. If we can get more than 200, that's great. But 200 is fine, and we may even want to drop that down or increase that a bit as the game goes. You can usually achieve this amount of income by getting somewhere between 4 and 6 Plascrete factories, especially if you start oppressing them. and you can always adjust accordingly depending on how village quirks, resources, and special regions pan out on the map. Now, before we continue on with the rest of our construction efforts and expanding our villages, let's take a quick look at the development screen. Now, when it comes to playing Harkonnen, some people like to focus on early economic developments, while others like to go and instill fear right away. Those are both valid ways to play Harkonnen in general, but with Cron, I like to go a little different route. I actually prefer to go towards survival training and then Arrakis Butchers early. The reason why is that getting Arrakis Butchers allows us to clear rebels and militia extremely quickly. Although we're not going to have a lot of rebellions very early on, it still allows us to clear militia from neutral villages in record pace. It also lets us farm manpower whenever we kill militia and rebel units. So every rebellion we have and every neutral militia that we kill ends up giving us more manpower. Now this is pretty good already, but on top of that we also get some water. And Cron is extremely hungry for water and manpower, and we're going to have a lot of buildings really quickly at the beginning of the game. So getting this technology lets us save quite a bit of Plascrete and upkeep on water and manpower buildings, which we can instead use on buildings that actually help our economy grow. Now, we just finished constructing our first Plascrete factory, and it's only been just over a day since it started construction. That's pretty fast. We just captured this village less than 2 days ago, and it's already starting to produce resources for us. Without Cron, this village would have taken 4 days to produce this one building, and in all that time this village would be doing next to nothing for us. Now, as our second building early on, I recommend building a research hub. Now, the reason why is that this increases the amount of developments that we can get early on in the game by producing extra knowledge for us. And early on, until we get more spice fields and get more villages, the primary way that we're going to be making our buildings more efficient is through developments. Now, once the second building is finished constructing, we have to make a decision if we're going to keep oppressing and building more buildings, or if we're going to take a break from that and expand elsewhere. Generally, with Cron, I recommend building as many early production buildings in single village, so long as you can sustain it with your Plascrete, Solari, and water levels. If you can, oppress your production-oriented villages so you can keep those buildings being constructed quickly. In the end, even if they suffer some production penalties for a while, having those buildings up and running as soon as possible is going to help you out more in the long run than waiting for them to build normally. If you've been paying close attention, this time you may have noticed that we ended up only being refunded 6 manpower when we press this village. That's because Cron Vatia only refunds manpower based on how many building slots are empty or unused. And we already have 2 building slots occupied, one by this Plascrete factory and one by this research hub. So we spent 20 manpower this time and only got 6 back. So all in all, we netted a loss of 14 manpower. That's just something to be aware of, is that the manpower refund gets less and less useful as you build more and more buildings. Now if we take a look at this village, we built 4 buildings in a matter of 6 days. Under normal circumstances, this would have taken a total of 16 days to construct all these buildings. That's a whopping 10-day difference. Now, sure, these buildings will be suffering a penalty to their production, but at least these buildings are producing something. If we had waited normally, the first building would have only just started providing resources for us for the past 2 days, and the second building would only be about halfway completed with its construction. Plus, although the oppression penalty sounds pretty bad, each penalty only lasts 10 days. So by the time the oppression penalty expires, our village will have produced way more of each resource than if we didn't use Cron Vatia to quickly build these buildings. And if we had the extra resources and we wanted to, we could go ahead and press this button again and quickly build a 5th building. But for now, I think you get the point. Generally speaking, Cron Vatia can drastically increase the speed that you construct buildings and really boost your economy during the early game. Now, there are some drawbacks to this method. First off, manpower. Remember, using oppression is not free. We do have to pay manpower, and although Cron does provide a pretty sizable refund to our manpower stores, it's still netting us a loss in manpower in the short term. We can kind of get around that if we're also constructing manpower buildings, such as recruitment offices, or if we're farming manpower from neutral militia, but that is something to keep in mind. You don't want to over-oppress and drastically waste all of your manpower stores. Secondly, production buildings do drain a lot of Plascrete, water, and Solari. As you can tell, we're already in the negative when it comes to Solari income. We have plenty stored up, so we're good for now. But if you're not careful and you overuse this method to build your villages, you can end up completely draining your Plascrete stores, causing your water levels to drop too low, and you'll start seeing that your Solari stores will go down to 0 and you'll go bankrupt. So, a word of warning, if you overuse this method, you may find yourself in the red way too quickly. However, using this method to quickly build even just 2 buildings in a village is still very much worth it, as you'll boost your production massively, and as long as you're balancing your incomes properly and keeping your Solari up, it's not too big of an issue. Here's an example. It's still early on in the game. We're still at the beginning of month 1. So, what do? Well, I recommend planning down more Plascrete factories. Again, normally it would take 4 days to construct a Plascrete factory, but with Cron Vatia and the Oppression mechanic, those Plascrete factories will be up and running in no time. After those Plascrete factories finish, I also recommend placing down additional research hubs as long as you can afford it, as this will help our economy even more in the early game and will help us out in the long run as we get more and more developments to boost our economy into the mid-game. One of the weaknesses of Cron Vatia that I mentioned earlier is that you're encouraged to construct lots of buildings really quickly. Early on, this can really eat into your Solari stores, so as soon as you've annexed your first handful of villages, start pillaging. After we've gotten Arrakis butchers, I like to move towards local dialect studies, so we can get some extra water and authority discounts to our new villages, as well as moving on to instill fear, so we can get further discounts on villages that we pillage. Now, you don't need instill fear, but Cron Vatia is a counselor that likes us to build villages really quickly, which means that we're probably going to run low on building slots in our villages relatively early on. Instill Fear helps us out with that, as over the course of the game, we can potentially make villages dirt cheap to annex, and we can keep expanding our economy. After Instill Fear, I recommend taking Lay of the Land, and then start making our way towards martial economy. Lay of the Land has had some rebalances over the last few patches. For a short time, it was extremely broken with Harkonnen, as it was tied to village production, but it's still pretty good for Harkonnen even after they've removed it. You can still get lots of territory with Harkonnen, so this development is basically a bunch of free research hubs that doesn't cost any Solari or any Plascrete. Also, this unlocks the Research Agreement Treaty, which can be very useful when forming treaties with other players, as it will massively boost your knowledge throughout the game. For the first agent, I recommend the standard Arrakis information. We don't generate much early authority compared to some other factions, and we want to start getting research and intel discoveries early on through the Arrakis information. From here, I prioritize authority gain with Arrakis for much of the game, as well as a few agents on Spacing Guild, CHOAM, and eventually counterintelligence. Harkonnen generally gets plenty of agents, so feel free to swap them around as you want for whatever win condition you're focusing, such as faction information if we're going for assassination, or placing a few agents on Landsrat if we're going for governorship. Generally speaking, I recommend keeping at least 2 on Arrakis, bare minimum of 2 on Spacing Guild, and 1 or more on CHOAM. That way, we can use some of the more key and commonly used operations available to Harkonnen, such as Scavenger Team, Sleeper Agents, Decoy Thumpers, Toxic Vapors, and Supply Drop. Along the way, as you recruit more units, try to find 1 or 2 villages that are within close distance of your territory to farm manpower using Arrakis butchers. This ensures a steady flow of manpower that's not dependent on expensive buildings like recruitment offices, and allows you to start adding militia to your villages for those production bonuses. Don't worry too much about getting heavy militia this early in the game. Just filling out your production villages with cheap militia will do the trick. Ideally, if you can find a village that's within range of your main base, Or, later on, when you start placing missile batteries in your villages, use those to quickly kill militia and increase your manpower stores at a rapid rate. For your first main base building, I highly recommend getting Administrative Hall in the Size 1 district, as not only will this massively boost your authority generation at a point in the game where your authority income is low, it'll also speed up your economy research. Later on, we can always swap this out for another main base building if we need to make use of the research discount later. Along the way to martial economy, we're going to get the development Advanced Engineering. This is crucial, as this not only unlocks the Mason Guild building, which will massively increase our Solari and Plascrete income, but it also grants additional production bonuses based on the number of buildings in each of our villages. When you combine this with village traits, militia bonuses, and the oppression mechanic, our villages will be potentially producing about 300% of what a normal village can do. As long as you've built enough research hubs and possibly found an economy discovery or two, your first main base building should finish around the time that Advanced Engineering completes. For our second main base building, I highly recommend placing a Mason Guild in our 3 size district. This is how we're going to keep our economy expanding with Cron Vatia. Due to the bonuses from Mason Guild, Advanced Engineering, and all of our militia production bonuses, once we've fully built our villages and placed down maintenance centers, even our non-productive villages will essentially pay for themselves, while our Spice and Solari-focused villages will be absolutely bathing in money. Now that martial economy is finished, it's time to start putting even more militia into our village and start oppressing constantly with Office of Order buildings. Having this building in a village will continuously oppress that village, even without us pressing the button. This building also will make the village's militia fight any rebels if a rebellion occurs, so I highly recommend placing this in your production-focused villages, as this will then allow your villages to quickly get back to work after a rebellion, while also giving you resources from killing militia. However, Office of Order drains 6 manpower from your income per day, which, as you can expect, can put a serious drain on our manpower. The manpower we got from pillaging neutral villages and farming manpower isn't going to cut it. For that reason, we're going to need more recruitment offices, which means we're also going to need more money. So, I recommend going down the left side of the economy tree after you've finished martial economy, and going down to your Tier 4 spice technologies. For our third main base building, I recommend getting the recruitment center and placing it in the 3 size district. Feel free to also dip into the military tree and get recruitment initiative early on. The great thing about recruitment center and recruitment initiative is that all these manpower production bonuses apply before the upkeep for our Office of Order buildings. So, having this building in month 2 in combination with a handful of recruitment offices will keep both our army reinforced as well as our Office of Order buildings oppressing our villages without draining all of our manpower. For your fourth main base building, I highly recommend getting recycling vats. Cron Vatia is going to allow us to build lots of buildings really quickly, but that also means that we're going to be using a lot of water, and if we don't have any water coming in, we're not going to be able to continue expanding. Once we finish our spice techs, I highly recommend continuing down into the military tree so we can increase our command point limit as well as increase our manpower production, or going into the statecraft tree and going down towards enhanced questioning. Enhanced questioning is exceptionally powerful with Cron Vatia and Harkonnen in general through the oppression mechanic. Also, unlocking the interrogation center building is key for Harkonnen throughout the mid and late game, as the interrogation center allows us to get 10 intel whenever we kill enemy units. This is exceedingly powerful when you consider the fact that oppression causes rebellions, and every time those rebels spawn, not only do these rebels give us money from Cron Vatia and manpower from Arrakis Butchers, but also give us intel, which we desperately need as Harkonnen. Now, once you have your key military and statecraft techs, as well as your economy up and running, I recommend going towards whatever victory condition you have. For example, if you're going for elimination, go into siege incentives and start taking out your opponent's bases. Or, if you want to win through Chom, take Chom support and start buying Chom rapidly from month 3 onwards. If you want to go for hegemony, go towards Savage Cleansing and Symbols of Authority. And if you want to go for assassination, continue further into the statecraft tree, getting Spy Mastery and Nefarious Contacts, and start assassinating the other players. Also, if you want to, you can go for Governor through the Crew Reputation path, and in combination with the intel gained from Enhanced Questioning and the Interrogation Center, you can pretty consistently spam operations on enemy players, giving you a large amount of influence. After you've decided your win condition, I thoroughly recommend going into local hubs and Civilian Defense Force. Civilian Defense Force will not only increase the health of your militia, but also give you additional militia slots, which will in turn increase your production. Local hubs also makes all your village buildings cheaper, so as you expand more and get more and more villages, you can quickly fill them up with buildings in combination with Cron Vatia's ability. Also, having access to the investment office is really helpful for optimizing your villages once you've gotten into the mid and late game. That way, you can optimize your production and see these numbers at the top get bigger and bigger. As far as heroes are concerned, I recommend taking Glossy Raban over Ayakin Nefud. Ayakin is a very powerful hero, don't get me wrong, but Raban has more synergy with Cron Vatia. The extra free heavy militia not only grants a small production boost, but it also helps us clear our rebels more quickly with our Office of Order. You want extra militia so you can put down rebellions as quickly as possible and get our production buildings back online. Here is a basic example of what you can expect out of a Cron Vatia Harkonnen by the time you get to the late game. When it comes to developments, you have all of your crucial economy technologies, you have plenty of intelligence coming in through Enhanced Questioning and the Interrogation Center, you have plenty of military technologies to keep your army up to par, and you have local hubs and Civilian Defense Force, so you can easily optimize your villages while also maximizing the defense whenever you send out your army to attack. One thing that's nice about this setup is that if your initial win condition, such as Chom, fails, you can always switch to another win condition within 1 or 2 technologies. That way, you can always go for a secondary win condition should other players successfully prevent you from getting your initial win condition. Here is an example of what your main base will probably look like towards the mid and late game. I thoroughly recommend that you keep at least 3 economy buildings so you can fill up this 3-size economy district for the 10% Solari production bonus, as well as keeping at least 3 military buildings in this 3-size district so you can get the 20% max health bonus to your military units. In this example, I have my administrative hall and 2 more military and 2 more statecraft buildings, but feel free to switch these up, though I thoroughly recommend that you at least keep Interrogation Center somewhere in your build, and if you can, keep your military academy, as those extra training slots will be crucial when it comes to fighting in the mid and late game as Harkonnen. Although Cron Vatia appears to be a primarily economy-focused counselor, there are ways that you can utilize Cron Vatia's abilities in order to create staging points in order to pillage and liberate opponents' villages, as well as more easily defend your borders. Let's say, for example, we just took this village. Now, we have this neighbor here, and it's in a very vulnerable position. But, much like Thufir for the Atreides faction, we can actually use Cron Vatia in order to very quickly build our defenses and protect this territory from attack while we're distracted elsewhere. Now look at that. We very quickly built up not 1, not 2, but 5 buildings that we can use to not only defend our territory, but also use to attack the nearby territories, protect against assassins, and in combination with the maintenance center, all of our militia, and the production bonuses we get from developments such as advanced engineering, the upkeep on these buildings is practically equal to how much Solari we're getting. One reason why Cron Vatia can also be used offensively as well as defensively is that rebellions, when they occur, normally disable most buildings. One of the exceptions is that they do not disable airfields. So, Even if you have rebellions on your territory, airfields on your villages are still active, meaning you can still use them as jumping off points even when they're attacked by rebels. House Harkonnen as a whole has many more nuances and useful ways to utilize their specific mechanics that I haven't mentioned in this video, and I may go more in depth with them as a whole in a later video. But for now, I hope this video has helped you understand how you can use Cron Vatia to make Harkonnen a force to be reckoned with as you battle for control of Arrakis.